So today we're going to be talking about imagination, both the imagination that comes from the artist and the imagination that you need or you can use if you care to look at a lot of art. So let's go on. I've shown this before and I've admitted it's my favorite painting, and you'll probably see it again if you keep on coming to class, but it was done in 1500 by, and there's my annoying little initials up there because some people like to guess the artist. So I hesitate and then I say it's Hieronymus Bosch. And when we put the PowerPoint on the website, I'll have all these names filled in for you. But this is one of the most fantastic works of imagination that I can think of. And it was done so early. It is a religious work, but I don't think it would, there's debates, they don't think it was ever an altarpiece. I mean, can you imagine praying in front of this? It goes from the Garden of Eden on the left to either paradise or sort of a symbol of how we're all sinning for the religious aspect, and then the Last Judgment on the right. So we're going to show a video now that is all about Hieronymus Bosch, and you will see some scenes from this picture. But think when you look at it about the amount of imagination that went in to portraying all of creation and beyond.
Hello, welcome to Art Talk. I'm going to have a look at one of my favourite artists, Hieronymus Bosch. He was a Flemish artist from the 15th and 16th century with a fantastic ability to create illustrative pieces that depict the modern world in Western Europe at that time. I don't know anything about his life. I've been reading quite a lot about him, and the fact is nobody does. Nobody's really sure exactly why he painted the things he did, but his paintings are fantastic. He has done a number of paintings credited with his signature, but there are at least 30 paintings with his style. Many of his contemporaries at the time copied his style because it was so good. And even to this day, people are looking at different ways of reinterpreting his artwork. There are numerous documentaries about his life and his artwork, and the picture that's been on the screen for some time appeared in one of my favourite films, In Bruges. As I look through his artwork, I'm finding it very difficult to figure out which ones are genuinely his. There are about 4 paintings called The Last Judgment, all of which feature fantastical creations like the Strawberry Man here, and symbolism from daily life. When we talk about symbolism, we mean something that looks like one thing, but perhaps means something else. An example could be a key. Obviously, it opens a door, but what door and why? Is it the door to the mind? That is symbolism. This painting, called Cutting the Stone, is one of his most famous pieces. It's fairly boring and mundane, but it represents a sense of belief and false hope in alternative medicines closely associated with mysticism and treachery. The conjurer shows a wealthy nobleman or merchant being mesmerized by somebody pulling a frog or a nugget or something out of a bag or under a cup, while one of his gang members steals a bag of money. I think this is a warning to humanity to be cautious of what we believe. What I really like about his paintings, though, is the way he illustrates in a very, I don't know where to look kind of sense. Most art, you follow, you look at a piece and you go, this is the focal point, this is the main thing. But Bosch's pieces, everything's everywhere. You could look at one bit, look at it the next day and find something completely different. It's like madness going on, and that is beautiful. Contrary to that last statement, I believe his commission pieces are done in a way that looks neat and tidy, whereas his own personal projects, the ones that really brought him acclaim, are freer in a way that expresses himself rather than what the customer demands. Of course, I don't know which ones they are, but I'm assuming the religious pieces, the ones that I don't really have much interest in, are the commission pieces. His use of colours are brilliant as well. I like the dusky tones that really bring out the expressions on the faces. The objects in the world just look effortlessly painted. And to be honest, I like the way everything is from real life. You'll see knives, you'll see crazy spoons, frying pans, pots, the things that were probably around him and his own life. I really like the monsters in his paintings as well. Some of the monsters you think it's just a tiny man with feathers, but actually that's quite a scary thing. And one thing we've all overlooked is the origins of the facehugger. Now, H.R. Geiger is credited for the creation of the facehugger because of his Alien series, but I actually believe that this painting has the facehugger on it. It's called Death of the Reprobate, and it's a very red piece about somebody dying in a bed, surrounded by what look like blackened lizards, snakes, perhaps a bull, and frankly, the alien. The ones in the corner especially look like the beginnings of what could be Alien, and the one on the left is definitely, without a doubt, a facehugger. A lot of Bosch's paintings are attributed to the occult, his use of dice and musical instruments as torture devices is certainly something questionable, but I don't believe he was involved in anything specifically weird. He was just interested in the way things sat in paintings. He is, of course, a bit weird. A lot of his stuff involves the ass, of all places. Trumpets coming out, pipes going in. It's a bit strange, but I think really he was one of the first surrealists, way before Salvador Dali. I love his stuff too, but this is just another level. It takes illustrative surrealism to a strange, dark world inhabited by ass trumpet knife-wielding maniacs. I mean, what more do you want? Well, what we want, Robin Weatherall, is a manna machine and evidence of flying saucers in the sky. This piece, The Garden of Earthly Delights, the central one, really depicts a utopian society, if you could call it that, inhabited by centaurs, some crazy pig dudes, obviously with asses going on, and a plethora of different foods that people are enjoying. I love this. I love the vibrant colours in it. And to me, it kind of scares me a little bit because these look like pod-born children, a bit like how I would imagine the Garden of Eden to be, except with more people. You're not alone, you know, it's Adam and Eve. There's loads of people here. This is what's really fascinating. And some of the buildings you can see, they definitely look otherworldly, like they've been bought here from another planet. I'm mostly intrigued by the fountain in the middle. That certainly looks like it's been placed, and a lot of alien theorists think that a manna machine was placed, so there could be something in it. But then again, it could just be a fantastical little fountain, beautifully illustrated in a way Bosch did so well. I just really like the way Bosch's paintings are laid out. Every face has a different emotion, there's always something going on, and I just believe his paintings have captured humanity's desperation, stupidness, and death timelessly. And I'm really happy that it's survived. It's mostly oil on wood, and the temperature changes of galleries and houses probably have had some damage on the painting. You can tell with the pictures. But aside from that, I think Bosch was one of the earliest comic artists. He takes imagery and happenings from everyday life and stylizes them in a very satirical way. And that's probably why I like him so much. And truthfully, I quite like the darkness in his paintings too. And that's Hieronymus Bosch. See you next time.
Well, that was an introduction to some of the kinds of paintings that we're going to be having today. The imagination that goes into that, I think, is so important. You can just stand in front of the Garden of Earthly Delights and read it and spend hours looking at the different details that I have around here. And there is a book of a woman who did just that for years. Terry Tempest Williams is a fantastic writer. She's a scientist as well as philosopher and literature expert. And she goes through details and talks about the connections she makes throughout the painting. So if you want to really get deep into it, it's not a light read. But that reminds me of some of the comments that you're going to be making. When you make a connection, either if it's something that gives you joy, or if it upsets you, or if it's something that confuses you, something you want to look into later, we'd love to find out about that. Here's another painter. When you paint a myth, something that doesn't exist, all you have is your imagination in how you show it. So showing the birth of Venus out of the seashell. Now you remember who the painter is, Botticelli. Botticelli is able to give a very lyrical feeling about that myth. I think the most lyrical thing is the motion, the beautiful motion in that gorgeous Titian colored hair. And then you see the god coming in there, blowing not only the wind into the picture, but blowing life into the picture. So he had to use his imagination. That's 15th century again. And now, once again, we're looking at, yes, Michelangelo. This is the Sistine Chapel, where he goes from the creation to Noah's Ark, telling the entire Old Testament. Once again, if you're talking religion, since none of these artists were there at the time, they have to use their imagination. The picture, of course, down in the lower right-hand corner of God creating Adam is probably the best known. I used it in my very first class of masterpieces, saying that there, to me, is a connection between a artistic creator and the viewer. That when the artistic creator, whether it's a painter, a musician, composer, but when they create a work of art and the viewer or the listener is touched in some way by it, like there's that touch going on, when those two fingers meet, there's a spark. Also, I'm showing it because of the imagination of some scholars of this work that say that that big scarf, the cloth behind God and his cherubs, is an interpretation of the human brain. And that what Michelangelo is saying is that God is giving Adam consciousness. And then also there, several years later, when he was an old man, Michelangelo created the Last Judgment. Once again, imagining Jesus passing judgment with, on the left-hand side of the altarpiece, we see people being sent to heaven, and on the right, condemned to hell. And one of those on the right-hand side was the self-portrait of Michelangelo as a flayed skin hanging from Saint Bartholomew, who was martyred in that way. The execution of that altarpiece was so difficult that he even wrote about it and said this is how he felt executing it. Here's one from an artist that we've looked at before on the left-hand side, but we haven't seen that work. It's your old favorite, the Joy Boy Goya, that some of you found hard to get through last time. He did a whole series called the Caprichos, the Caprices, and they were satires on the life that he was living, particularly on the government and on the church, against the Inquisition, against the government. And here he says, the sleep of reason. In other words, when reason, enlightenment is asleep, monsters come in. On the right, we have a contemporary artist who has reproduced the Caprichos in different settings. Notice it's called The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters Asia. Well, it's pretty weird because we see a Black man wearing what is called African kinds of prints. This artist, who is British Nigerian, born in London, grew up in Africa, is now back in London and very successful, does riffs on post-colonial world. And he always has this fabric. He even wraps books in it. He shows this as a sign of what is happening with post-colonialism, because this is not an African print. It was done by a Dutch company, produced in Africa, and is now in Indonesia. And that's one of his riffs on colonialism. By the way, some of these philosophies are something else that you can post on the website. We have a forum going on now about the destruction of art and about money in art, and perhaps you have some ideas about some of these other points. And then, of course, the imagination of Vincent V. Yes, Vincent van Gogh, most of you picked that up. And he's looking out from the asylum where he has committed himself because his mental illness was getting more pronounced. And he has a purely imaginary view of that. This view does not exist. The village looking out from the asylum, which you can visit today, does not look like that. But most of us don't even see the village. We see Van Gogh showing us in paint the movement of the stars, and he sees things in motion all the time, which everything is. So that is how his imagination interpreted that scene. And then his roommate and rival and fellow artist, PG, yes, Paul Gauguin, created this incredible mural from his imagination. His whole South Seas period was from his imagination, because the South Seas that he was in had already become much more modern in the 19th century, but he pictured it the way that he had imagined it beforehand. But here he, like Bosch, is telling us the whole history of the world through his imagination. On the right, we have the birth within the family. In the middle, we have the life as it is existing, somewhat of a paradise. We see the plucking of the apple from the tree, a reference to Eden. We even see gods of the South Seas. We have children tranquilly at play. Then as we go left, we see maturity. And at the very end, the elderly woman who was holding her hands to her head, just like in Munch's The Scream, saying, "Where are we going?" So it's maybe a good little one to look at for today's apocalypse that we've been living through. We've shown Magritte several times during this session. Next week, next term, not next week, but next term in the spring term, we'll spend more time on Magritte and the other surrealists that we've sort of alluded to today. I often have said I don't really like the isms too much, because I think Bosch was a surrealist and so is Magritte. But here he is showing with a still life. I had this on my website, sort of teasing you I'd be showing you still life, as well as making a comment through his imagination about what we hold dear in our life, calling it personal values, bringing the outside into this room with the gigantic personal possessions. Now, I wonder if you know this artist. I'm sure that many of you do. This is Banksy. We don't really know his name. We don't really know when he was born. He remains anonymous, and you can call him a graffiti artist, but you can also say that he is an artist of the imagination. And you might also call him a Dada artist, which we're going to also be speaking of next spring, because of something he did with this picture. He has a stencil, and he stencils pictures on walls all over the world. And people have begun to understand, oh, this is a Banksy, and they are artistic. This is under the Waterloo Bridge in London. Okay, let's look and see what happened with the Waterloo Bridge in London. That picture was sold for $1,376,000 at auction, Sotheby's, I believe. And the moment when the gavel went down the price, Banksy had included in the frame a shredder. And at that moment, the picture shredded. Now, on my website, we'll post a video of this happening, when it happened at auction, and also how Banksy did it. But it was bought by a collector, a woman collector in Europe. Now I understand it's up for sale and they think they'll get at least $5 million for it. So once again, if you want to talk about money and art, this might be a way, but tremendous imagination on the part of Banksy. Now, I want to talk about an aspect of looking at art that has to do with the imagination from the point of view of a child. My point is not saying you should be going to the inner child or anything like that, or you know, dressing like a child, although I kind of did today. But I think this is so important. And what I'm giving you now is the beginning of one of my favorite books, and I know that a lot of you know it, The Little Prince. It begins this way. Once, when I was 6 years old, I saw a magnificent picture in a book called True Stories from Nature about the primeval forest. It was a picture of a boa constrictor in the act of swallowing an animal. In the book, it said, boa constrictors swallow their prey whole without chewing it. Well, after that, they are not able to move and they sleep through the 6 months that they need for digestion. Well, I pondered deeply then over the adventures of the jungle, and after some work with a colored pencil, I succeeded in making my first drawing. Here's drawing number 1. What do you see? Look all the way to the right. There's a little clue there. Okay. I showed my masterpiece to the grown-ups, and they asked them whether the drawing frightened them. They answered me, why should anyone be frightened by a hat? My drawing was not a picture of a hat. It was a picture of a boa constrictor digesting an elephant. Then I drew the inside of the boa constrictor so the grown-ups could see it clearly. They always need to have things explained. My drawing number 2 looked like this. The grown-ups' response this time was to advise me to lay aside my drawings of boa constrictors, whether from the inside or the outside, and devote myself instead to geography, history, arithmetic, and grammar. That is why, at the age of 6, I gave up what might have been a magnificent career as a painter. I had been disheartened by the failure of my drawing number 1 and my drawing number 2. Grown-ups never understand anything by themselves, and it is tiresome for children to be always and forever explaining things to them. Well, the point that I'm making here is that sometimes we have to sort of clear our minds the way children's are, that's not filled with quite as much as we have going on all the times in our minds, in order to accept what some of these artists are trying to do with their imagination. Now, shameless personal digression, then this is even doubly shameless because it's scenes from my book. A lot of the scenes in my book are taken from the home movies that my father did while I was growing up. And this one, and I put some of those home movies on my website. This particular one I haven't put on yet, but it shows me, I was probably around 6, and I was running into the room so excited to get into my artwork, really enthralled with it, when all of a sudden my father from behind his camera told me, your face is too close to the book, get your face farther away, which took away my fun entirely. And then it shows me going through the different relatives that were in the room, showing them the art. Finally, I ended up drawing on the chin of the my godfather down at the bottom there. But let's look at some of my masterpieces. They have a surrealistic quality, I think you would agree. We have the similarly hatted couple on the left who are going through a snowstorm, which is very difficult in Crayola to show on a white page, so it's done with black. And unfortunately, as they try to escape, they've left the rainbow behind. So they've left hope. It's all metaphorical. Then in the middle, you'll see that I have a high wire act where the high wire performer is performing not only without a net, but without a high wire. And then on the right, and see the big cow, where I have used sort of an El Greco approach to elongating my figures. The cow is bigger than the haystack. So sometimes it's style, sometimes it's message that we can see in some of these imaginative works. Imagination is more important than knowledge. Knowledge is limited. Imagination encircles the world. And that's from a person who certainly had a lot of knowledge. So our first artist did not have a lot of knowledge about painting. He was self-taught. He was a customs official, which in French is called le douanier, and he is often called le douanier instead of his name. He's Henri Rousseau, who had a great deal of childlike imagination in not only his style, but in his subjects. Since he was self-taught, he sometimes had a little trouble with perspective. For example, the showing that the dog in the front is farther away, he had a little scale problem, and it looks like he's got a wheel problem against the curb there. And then in this commissioned work, showing the family in a wagon, he's making himself as the driver, which they had not expected. But he had a beautiful, ingrained from just talent to create masterpieces, even though he was self-taught. Look at the dream. How many human figures do you see? How many animals? What do you think about the way that the foliage is depicted? Let's look at a video about this picture as well as about Rousseau as an artist.
I'm guessing you've seen this painting before, or one of the other very recognizable jungle paintings created by French artist Henri Rousseau. Maybe it just crosses your register as art, as odd as any other picture you pass in a museum or pack of postcards. But I'd like us to pause for a moment to consider its strangeness. Why is this naked woman reclining calmly on a sofa in the middle of a jungle, while lions and a snake roam close by and a musician emerges from its depths? What is it that's so peculiar about this image that captivated audiences in 1910 and still compels us today? Let's better know Henri Rousseau's The Dream. Rousseau wasn't trying to play tricks on anybody. When he first displayed the work at the spring 1910 Salon des Indépendants in Paris, he titled it simply The Dream and accompanied it with a poem that goes, "Having fallen into a gentle sleep, Jadwiga in a dream heard the sound of a musette, played by a benevolent musician. While the moon shone down upon the flowers, the green trees, the wild serpents listened to the instrument's merry tunes." So there you go. She's dreaming, you see. Her name is Jadwiga, and while she may be asleep on the sofa in the waking world, in dreamland she's alert, pointing our way into the scene with her sharp features and gaze, as well as her outstretched finger. She directs us to notice the wide-eyed lion and lioness, and the brightly skirted musician who peers out of the darkness while playing a musette, and charming the snake in the lower right. At first the snake looks like it's solid orange and slithering away, but then we notice its eye, just barely discernible, and that its top side is black and underbelly bright orange. Another eye peeks out of the jungle, this one belonging to what we make out to be an elephant, and two birds perch in the trees, one with extravagant plumage. We're surrounded by a cacophony of repeating forms. Each leaf of each plant is clearly defined, and lotus-like flowers, impossibly large, sprout across the canvas. We have a repetition of eyes that stare back at us, and also orbs. Not just hers, but the oranges in the tree above, and of course the full moon in the clear sky. The dream is jam-packed with visual information to process, and we haven't even mentioned the 3 little monkeys also perched in the trees, or the banana bunches here and there, or how the echoing lines of the foliage generate a kind of vibrating rhythm. It's a dense composition, every square inch considered, and it's a balanced and cohesive one too, even drawing comparison to such masterworks as Botticelli's Primavera. But its maker, for almost all of his career, was thought of as kind of a joke, and openly mocked as an utterly unschooled outsider. During his life, he was known as Le Douanier, French for customs officer, because of his more than 20-year career collecting tolls on goods and produce entering the city of Paris. His actual job wasn't as high-powered as the nickname suggests, but it did leave him enough time to paint. He began exhibiting in the mid-1880s and resigned his post in 1893 at the age of 49 to devote himself fully to his art. He had a pension and gave art and music lessons, but even living modestly, he was always short on funds. Rousseau lost 2 wives and several children to illness, and himself died at the age of 66 due to an untreated leg infection, with only 1 daughter surviving him and just months after completing the dream. There are many aspects of this painting that would not have been a surprise for art-going audiences of early 20th century Paris. They'd seen plenty of nudes lounging on sofas before. Manet's Olympia was still in recent memory, and before that there'd been Ingres, and before that there'd been Titian. And before Titian, there'd been Giorgione. But Rousseau's figure, while acknowledging this lineage, sets herself apart by her firm frontality. Jadwiga is strong, not soft. A Polish variant of Hedwig, she's possibly named after an early love interest of Rousseau's. But she's rather unlike the fleshy, naturalistic bodies of his predecessors, with her oddly tubular fingers and toes. Those nudes were built up gradually with layers of thin glazes, techniques championed by the French Academy and their École des Beaux-Arts, which Rousseau did not attend. He was self-taught. His education derived from looking. He obtained a license that allowed him to copy artworks at the Louvre and the Musée de Luxembourg. And while he would never achieve the highly finished effects of the works he attempted to reproduce, Rousseau evolved his own distinctive manner of painting. And he wasn't the only one experimenting with more inventive, less naturalistic renderings of bodies and everything else. Modernism was all around. Many were shirking the Academy's values and presenting their own propositions for what art could and should be. Rousseau was both of the modernists and not. He was always seen as inferior, an amusing amateur. His first real attention came in 1886 with Carnival Evening, displayed at the same exhibition as Seurat's famous Sunday on La Grande Jatte. Both works caused a stir, Seurat's for its innovative pointillist technique and scientific mastery of color, and Rousseau's for its playful innocence and seeming obliviousness to the conventions of perspective and modeling. Attracting both mockery and admiration, Rousseau slowly grew a base of support as he showed his work, counting many younger artists among his fans who prized what they saw as his directness and originality. The first of his jungle paintings appeared in 1891, but the bulk of them came later, after the success of his Hungry Lion at the 1905 Salon d'Automne. It was there that a handful of artists using wild colors were dubbed by critics les fauves, or the wild beasts, and spurred the movement they called fauvism. Rousseau wasn't one of them, but the proximity of his literal depiction of wild beasts might have helped inspire the naming. His work was unlike the fauves, aspiring to more lifelike coloration and representation, and his subject matter wasn't that far afield historically. French great Eugène Delacroix had gained much acclaim for his depictions of fierce animals. Rousseau's work can certainly be seen as part of the late 19th and early 20th century romantic interest in all things far-flung and lesser known. While some artists had indeed traveled to the places they described, plenty worked from source material or used their imagination to concoct their scenes. While Rousseau sometimes claimed he'd been to Mexico during his military service, the truth was that he'd never ventured much farther than Paris and its environs. He did travel virtually, however, in large part thanks to the 1889 Paris Paris World's Fair, which brought new zoology galleries to the Museum of Natural History, including both live and taxidermied animal displays. Rousseau worked from photographs and illustrations of animals, sometimes using an enlarger called a pantograph to trace subjects from books and magazines. And the city's magnificent Jardin des Plantes provided him plenty of inspiration for botanical life. Still, Rousseau took many liberties with his subjects, setting his flora and fauna at whatever scale seemed to suit his purposes. The space of his pictures is often flat, disregarding linear perspective or adjusting it as needed. The light often comes from several sources, contributing to the eerie ambiguity of time of day in works like The Dream. Some of his compositions are simplistic, and others densely complex, filled with tightly interlocking forms, each clearly defined, as if he paints in a language of nouns, in the words of artist and author Craig McDaniel. The art world of Paris called his work primitive and naive, partly due to what seemed like exotic subject matter, but mostly because of his non-academic style of painting. Those were terms they also used to describe large swaths of creative production from outside of Europe, and also pre- or early Italian Renaissance art, to which Rousseau's work was sometimes compared. But whatever it was he was doing, people were starting to like it, and he wasn't going to shift course now. He'd befriended influential poet and critic Guillaume Apollinaire, and was the honored guest of a banquet hosted by Picasso in 1908, attended by the likes of Gertrude Stein. Robert Delaunay and Max Weber collected his work, as did famed dealer Ambroise Vollard. Rousseau once remarked in a letter, "If I have preserved my naivete, it is because Monsieur Jérôme, who was a professor at the Beaux-Arts, as well as Monsieur Clermont, director of Beaux-Arts at the École de Lyon, urged me never to lose it. The time will come when you will no longer think this strange. I have been told that my work is not of this century. I cannot now change my manner, which I have acquired as the result of obstinate toil." And thank Jadwiga for his obstinate toil. He remained ever true to his vision and fully dedicated to his work, despite hardship and near constant criticism. He was the butt of practical jokes concocted by often patronizing artists he considered friends, but remained good-natured and amiable. He was also a violinist and composer, and liked to entertain guests in his studio. When he died rather suddenly, authorities buried him in an unmarked pauper's grave, but this was rectified once discovered. His friends raised money for a proper burial, with a tombstone made by the sculptor Constantine Brancusi and an epitaph by Apollinaire. His influence and renown only grew as younger artists emulated him and exhibitions and writing about him spread. The surrealists loved him, of course, preoccupied as they were with dreams and the uncanny. Their leader, André Breton, called The Dream a masterpiece that comprehends all the poetry and with it all the mysterious gestations of our time. It was eventually collected by the Museum of Modern Art in New York, where it has remained a highlight of the permanent collection. By the way, did we mention this painting is huge, nearly 7 by 10 feet, and it's been the subject of poems, too, by Michael Ondaatje in 1974, and before that by Sylvia Plath, who concluded her 1958 Sistine for the Douanier with an additional explanation for our lounging lady in the jungle. But to a friend in private, Rousseau confessed his eye so possessed by the glowing red of the couch, which you, Jadwiga, pose on, that he put you on the couch to feed his eye with red, such red, under the moon in the midst of all that green and those great lilies. For we are enchanted by Rousseau's dream just as the jungle creatures are enchanted by the musician's tune. We are transported into this world just as the woman on the couch is carried off to this dreamland. This happens in part because of Rousseau's gifts as a colorist and the luminosity that emanates from each and every vibrant form and coalesces into a mesmerizing unified whole. It also happens because of that particular undefinable Rousseau magic. The artist once opined, "If my parents had recognized my gift for painting, today I would have been the greatest and wealthiest painter in France." While this may have been true, with academic finish and training, Rousseau would not have become a modernist hero. He might not have found that Rousseau magic, that peculiar and distinctive voice. Jadwiga is in the jungle because Rousseau wanted her there, and he wanted to take us along with her. He had confidence in his vision and the commitment to see it through. The results, as we can still see, are extraordinary, truly extraordinary. And we can follow Jadwiga into this dream world whenever we like and revel for a bit in this genuinely surreal reality that never was and never will be.
Well, of course, I chose it because I liked it, but I really liked a lot of the comments. And I love Sylvia Plath taking the point of view of guessing where the artist came from as he or she is creating these pieces. Here's another one with that mystical, dreamlike quality of the sleeping gypsy with the mandolin. And who knows, is that lion going to stop being so tranquil? So there's some storytelling there. And I'm pretty sure I see a little face in that moon. But isn't that night sky fantastic? I think I mentioned it last week when we were looking at one of the pictures, I think from George Lucas's collection, that moire effect that goes down into the hills. It's a gorgeous painting. There's that sky again in the Carnival Evening on the left. Such a beautiful, beautiful background for those lacy trees. Again, that dreamlike quality. And then there's just pure fun in the football players whose mustaches match Rousseau's. Let's look at 4 different children that have been painted and see if you can match the artist to each one. Which one is by Rousseau? Which one by Picasso? Which one by Renoir? Which by Goya? Going from left to right, we have our Goya, one of his happier pictures, a little member of the court. And then the next one is Rousseau. Look at the puppet, it's got that Rousseau mustache and that funny kind of a stocky kind of a kid that he likes to create. There is Renoir's Girl with the Watering Can, which for a long time was the most popular painting in the Museum of National Art in Washington, replaced by Salvador Dali. And then to the right, I think most people would know that that is a Picasso, a Cubist work. So here is another side of Henri Rousseau, who was very much affected by the Franco-Prussian War that had taken place during his lifetime, and that he saw the effects of all around him with people who'd been in the war that France lost to Germany. And here he's showing the rampage of war. Now, people had seen by this time the Meyer-Bridge studies of photography showing that horses can have all 4 hoofs off the ground at once, but she's ugly from my point of view and primitive looking. It often is true with Rousseau. Just taking a rampage, the trees are broken, and then scattering along the bottom are the dead and the dying, civilians, innocent people who have lost limbs and their lives because of war. Well, of course, I have to refer back to Guernica, where also we see the people who've been innocent people around the lamplight up above. Look at that lamp. I pointed it out in Carrie Mae Weems last week in George Lucas's collection. That sort of is a symbol, like the hearth of the lamplight that's over the family's home. So the people here, the women, are screaming over the loss of their children. It is just screaming rage against war, as did Rousseau's and hereby Picasso. So is Rousseau naive? Well, maybe. That might be the best part of his work. Primitive, yeah, his work is now labeled primitive in style, and a lot of it. Is it a joke? Well, Picasso thought it was. He's one of those people that's referred to in the video. He presented Rousseau with a model that said world's greatest painter, and invited some of his friends like Gertrude Stein around to make fun of him. And Rousseau said, "You and I are the most important artists of the age. You in the Egyptian style, I in the modern one." So Rousseau was not lacking in self-confidence. Well, here we go. We've referred to Picasso in the past. We referred to him again today. A difficult artist to get to know, a difficult man who is grouped with those that say, should we really look at his art because he was not a very nice man? We say that about Woody Allen. We say about Caravaggio, Renaissance painter, Baroque painter who was committed a murder. But I think that the artwork, and this is a debate you might want to discuss, the artwork is all that matters. And Picasso said, every child is an artist. The problem is to remain an artist once they grow up. Well, here he is in the masks that he created, his little disguises, playing jump rope with some of his children. And he did keep that. So he does have very serious topics. He shows serious things and some things that is very hard to understand, but he was always experimenting with the open-mindedness of the child. Okay, that was done with when he was in his period of being influenced by African masks, African culture. There are movies that have Picasso. He's in Midnight in Paris, Woody Allen's picture, Surviving Picasso, about his way he treated women, in this wonderful play that was written by Steve Martin that maybe some of you had the chance to see because it's sometimes performed locally. And in it, it's all the artists around Montmartre. It's a lot of fun. And then there are children's books. When Picasso met Matisse is about their relationship. They, like Van Gogh and Gauguin, had a friendship and a rivalry we'll be talking a little bit more about later. So as we get into Picasso's work, a comment that I made earlier that you often hear is, a 4-year-old could have painted this. Well, here's a cartoon that says, you are a 4-year-old? Well, in that case, a 3-year-old could have painted this. Okay, let's look at some of Picasso. He had a lifetime changing, always searching for new ways to express what he thought and what he saw. So here's his self-portrait at 15 years, his self-portrait at 90. Look at the works that he was doing at 9, at 12, and at 14. Picasso was a prodigy. He was an artistic genius. 14, 15, 16. Somebody asked in one of the classes if it's true that Picasso used only blue paint during his blue period because that was the only paint he could afford. And I said I'd heard that also, but I wasn't sure. But you can read this when you get the PowerPoint. But this apparently, when he was only 19, he lost his very close friend, the poet Picasso to suicide. So there's a blue period painting of his friend and his death scene down below. And in the blue period, he painted very somber subjects. See Celestina on the left. We think of Velázquez, Goya, who sometimes showed people with different kinds of deformities, different kinds of problems. The sleeping drinker whose glass is empty, so might be sleeping from emptying the glass too much. The view, mysterious view of family life on the right. We see the woman in the blue mantle. Like in literature, often if a woman with a child is in blue, it refers back to the Madonna. Here is Picasso on the two pictures on either side. And in the middle, do you recognize D? Degas, yeah, post-impressionist. And here he is showing, Picasso is showing in his elongated, heavy figure, the very thin woman who is pressing so hard on her iron that we just feel the weight of her labor. And then in a detail from Degas' laundresses, we see the same problem, just tired from the labor, but really a jolly looking woman yawning the way we might at any time. So I think it's a wonderful contrast of showing the same subject. And then we see Degas' absinthe drinkers and compare the woman looking over her absinthe out into whatever reality she's seeing, and compare it once again to the same kind of a thin, elongated woman at her empty glass from Picasso. But the Rose period, I think, such a contrast. I mean, it's like looking at a different artist. Here we have two views of acrobats. Look at the ape looking up at the family on the in the picture to the left, and that family is posed in the same kind of a triangular position that we see many holy families that were painted during the Renaissance. Then the wonderful pastels that are used, and particularly in the picture on the right, those flowers, that garland, really lovely renditions of what Picasso has seen, much more jolly than the blue period. Okay, here we have pictures of motherhood. 3 of these are by Picasso, and one of them, a picture that I've shown you before, is not. By the way, it is 11 o'clock, but I'm going to finish Picasso because we got started a little bit late, and so we'll go for a break after that. So on the left is a Picasso during the Rose period, the nursing mother. To the right is a mother and child from an entirely different period when he was doing paintings that were like Greek sculptures, giving them a monumental look, like I said about Diego Rivera last week. The one to the right is Picasso during his Cubist period. And then the next one is Van Gogh. You can certainly see a Van Gogh influence in all the movement in that fire, in those moving brush strokes. Again, using blue for the mother in the mother and child. And Picasso, again, during the blue period, showing his mother and child. So here's 2 views of childhood. One of them is by Picasso, and one of them is by a painter that we've shown before, who specialized in pastelish portraits of children. The one on the left is Picasso. Although it was done through the blue period, it has an upbeat quality. They're rosy cheeks. And then the rosy cheek child on the right is Renoir, a portrait of his child, Claude Renoir. One subject, 2 artists. The old guitarist on the left is in the blue period. Same characteristics as the laundress and the absinthe drinker we saw earlier. On the right, a completely almost abstract picture where he's deconstructed it into planes, into shapes. You can just barely make out the head, and the guitar and the arms. They're all visible on studying the picture. An intellectual approach. Okay, now we're going to look at one subject through the eyes of different artists. Here we have a Picasso and a Matisse. I think you can readily tell that it is the Picasso in the woman sitting on the striped chair with her breasts exposed on the left, and it is a Matisse on the right. 2 artists, same subject. Let's look at that relationship. They were friendly rivals. Here we have Matisse during his final days, right before his death, when in his studio he kept caged doves, but he usually had them flying around. On the right is one of the paintings that Picasso did after the death of his friend. And he's done it in a Matisse style, showing the view of the Mediterranean from inside the room in Nice, and put Matisse's doves around the picture. And the dove of Picasso has become a symbol for peace. Now, this one was done long before. It was done by Picasso at age 21. But this child holding the dove is connected with Picasso, and Picasso is connected with doves. With his communist leanings, he did a cover for a communist gathering of people who were looking for peace in the world. And then on the right, he shows two of his line drawings of doves, beautiful lyrical line drawings with the doves holding the olive branch. Now, look at this. We've shown Susanna and the Olders again. I won't go into detail about it, but this is a Baroque artist, woman. And in the next slide, we'll show who she is. Those of you who've been in former classes or already know her. Artemisia Gentileschi, a woman painter. And here is Picasso's rendition, showing the woman, Susanna, who's been at her bath, and the people in the background who are coming in to tell her that they want to have their way with her. She's going to be raped. And the same thing in his line drawing. Here is Bathsheba at the bath. Do you recognize this artist? That is Rembrandt. And here is Picasso's rendition of the same scene, the servant washing the feet of the woman at her bath, done in a painting and in a drawing. We've talked about luncheon at the grass, on the grass. And here we have that saucy woman looking out at the viewer. And she's sitting there with men who are fully clothed. And she's tossed her clothes down at the bottom. And that woman in the background, if she stood up, she'd be 10 feet tall. This is done by, and we'll see it in the next slide, Monet. And Picasso did 27 different versions of the same scene. Here is Las Meninas, the important painting that talks about getting the viewer inside the painting, where you see in the background the mirror where the viewer would be reflected, but it's the king and queen of Spain that the court is being pictured here. And there is Velázquez behind, oh, I gave it up, we're gonna guess. Velázquez behind the canvas, painting the picture. So we're invited to come into the scene. And on the right, if you look, you see the artist behind the easel, you see the reflection in the mirror, the man in the door in the back, the windows on the side, and the dog is turned into a dachshund. Pablo and his women, of course, notorious. There's Dora Maar, one of his mistresses. And on the right, we see his portrait of her weeping. And for me, if his intention was to show grief, I feel it in this picture, as I do in Guernica. So here, one woman shown in the blue period, Gertrude Stein, who was his mentor, as she was of Hemingway and other people in Paris. A woman shown in one style of Cubism, and on the right, another that is influenced by Matisse with that overall patterning. And this one is one of his most famous. It's in MoMA in New York City. it is the beginning of his Cubist style, where he's showing 5 women. And Avignon is not referring to Avignon in the south of France. It is referring to a street in Barcelona of brothels. Sometimes Picasso would call this the women of the brothel, or the chicas, he would say sometimes, the young ladies of the brothel. They have different masks, the one on the left and the 2 on the right, sort of an Indonesian kind of a mask on the left, and on the right, 2 African masks. In the middle, they're more of an Iberian, kind of a Caucasian look. The thing that's unusual about them is that they're all staring with these, well, not all, but mostly staring right at the viewer. The sharpness, the shards, even in that still life in front, give us sort of an off-putting kind of feel. Well, let's end for now while you take your 5-minute break with a little Cubist humor. I know it's not easy going through Picasso. And as a former developer of toys, I just loved this. There's the child putting together Mr. Potato Head with the eyes, the nose, and the mouth all on one side. Look at the portraits on the back. And then I just love that Etch-a-Sketch with that sort of Cubist picture there. And we go to another, you see that other personal diversion. My father was a cartoonist, and on the left in 1931, when art was sort of turned upside down, he did this little Easter cartoon, and it's showing, the Easter rabbit who is saying, "The world is getting tired of traditional things. I'm sure it'll welcome my design for a modernistic egg." And then up at the top, you'll see a friend of ours who was a fellow Disney artist at Disney, did some sort of cubistic renditions of Mickey Mouse while he was there. This is Ward Kimball. He was one of Disney's 9 old men who were young men who were his top animators. He's the one who designed Jiminy Cricket. And now another cartoonist. We're going back to Wayne Thiebaud. He was at Disney as an animation apprentice when he was 17 years old, the same time that my father was there in the early days of the Disney studio. There you see him doing cartoons on the left. Now, look at these 2 Wayne Thiebaud paintings. What do you see? What are they picturing? Okay, let's look. San Francisco. Look at the photograph there. Somebody somehow is exaggerated, but I'm sure that most of you have driven in San Francisco, where you just feel each time you go on one of those hills that you're driving off the end of the world. Where Wayne Thiebaud bought a house in San Francisco and started photographing different places where this happened. He went on the corners where Bullitt was photographed. And so you see another one of those renditions down at the bottom here. Well, in my personal digression, when he was said in the last paragraph, in conceiving the series, Thiebaud liked to credit Crazy Cat, the comic strip. And this is the important part. Cartoons allow the silly to sit with the sublime. Just loved that quote. And of course, thought of my father, who worked at a studio called Charles Mintz before he went to Disney, and they animated Crazy Cat. He would, at that time, he was courting my mother. This is again in the early 30s. And the top cartoon shows my father, who always pictured his red hair. Here he also has the pencil eraser in red, talking to Crazy Cat, who's on the top of his drawing board. And he's saying, "Is there any other language I could use to better convince Maxie that I'm plumb nuts about her?" Nuts means nuts in 1930. And below, a cartoon he did when he really wanted to be working for Walt Disney. And he has all these kids around him, and it says, "Won't you draw us a Mickey Mouse?" And at the bottom, he says, how crazy cat cartoonists get that way. Well, my father had the same thing that Wayne Thiebaud had in his work and others that were pointing out, this childlike humor, this sense of whimsy that I just love. Which brings us back to gumballs. You remember that we looked at his whimsical picture of the gumball machine last week, and that we said that he actually gave a gumball machine to one of the members of our class. So let's find out who it is. This is the portrait that he did in 1964, The Man in the Blue Chair. And it's a portrait of Malcolm Weintraub when he was living in Sacramento as a successful attorney. And he was not only very close friends with Wayne Thiebaud, but lived right down the street. And he and his wife collected Wayne Thiebaud's work. Here we have that wonderful blue chair, that blue shadow we often see in Wayne Thiebaud, and Malcolm looking quite lawyerly, including these beautiful shoes that he's wearing. And at the end of his sitting, after sitting for 3 days from 5 o'clock in the afternoon to 8 o'clock at night, it was all over. The weekend came. Malcolm was going home, and Wayne Thiebaud said, wait, Malcolm, I don't have the shoes quite right. And so he had to leave his shoes over the weekend. And here we have another portrait. This is a portrait of our Judith, Malcolm's wife, who we all lost last year, my friend, and I know a friend of many of you. And she is in the portrait on the right called Five Seated Figures, done in 1965. And here she is sitting in one of those blue chairs, that beautiful pink outfit there. And what I have on the left, which you can read later, is a description of her and all that she did for art in Sacramento in the obituary in the Sacramento Bee. The funny thing about when she was posing is that she was nursing the fourth of their 6 children, and she'd have to, at breaks from posing, run home, nurse the kid, and come on back. And the person on her right came in a black dress. And after Wayne Thiebaud did the whole thing, he didn't like it, so he turned it to stripes. The 3 men in the back are all fellow artists. And then down on the left, you see Judith posing in the same dress in front of that painting when it was in a gallery in New York, 50 years later. She and Malcolm had gone to this showing. She went into the ladies' room, changed into the dress, which she could still wear, and posed in front of it. Well, Wayne Thiebaud did more than still life of desserts, more than the streets of San Francisco. Look at this landscape on the left. Talk about imagination. Here we see the Sacramento Delta from many different imagined perspectives. From a drone's eye view, bird's eye view, and look down at the little village in the upper left-hand quadrant, little boat there. We're looking at those straight on. The whole picture is just a beautiful composition, an imagined landscape. And here we have another one at the right with that curvy street going through the streets. That's done by another artist that we looked at last week for still life. Do you know who it is? Let's look. That's David Hockney. I brought these 2 artists, David Hockney, still working, English artist. Oh, by the way, Wayne Thiebaud is still living in November. He'll be 101 years old. So here's David Hockney. He's in his 80s and still working. Here is his very, very famous Mulholland Drive, The Road to the Studio. David Hockney fell in love with Southern California for many reasons. One of them is for its sunshine, for its reputation of La La Land. He had a studio in the Santa Monica Mountains, the Hollywood Hills area, where he did this painting of Mulholland Drive, going across the curvy drive you do from San Fernando Valley into West Los Angeles. Once again, look at the perspective. Those electrical standards that you see there. By the way, if you read barbarian nurseries. You remember there was a movie that was made under those, are from straightforward on. But then he has even a maps grid of a perspective of it. And then a view that looks as if you're sort of a pigeon honing in on the crops. Magnificent picture. And this one is 7 feet tall by 24 feet long. It's a huge painting. As I said, he fell in love with that. He loved the gay lifestyle in Southern California. He has many documenting that life, the pool culture, the quintessential David Hockney pictures of Southern California become almost a meme for Southern California. The palm trees that we see it reflected in the windows, and that splash that he said was so difficult to paint in oils, to paint something that was that liquid. And here is something else that you have to use your imagination to paint. The Grand Canyon, obviously too big. He took photographs from all different places, and then he created 60 different canvases to create this almost 7 foot tall by 24.5 foot long picture with these jewel tones that for him in his imagination are picturing the glory of the colors that you see and all sorts of different perspectives. Okay, I just want to remind you for a second again of Guernica, because we're going to be looking at that picture from a new point of view. It's from a new artist, and I don't know if you recognize him, but this artist did the sculpture you see to the right in homage to Guernica. It's in the Reina Sofia Museum, which is very near the Prado in Madrid. And I was there looking because I knew that this artist, Richard Serra, had a work there. I didn't know what it was. And I also knew that Guernica was transferred from the Museum of Modern Art in New York back to its home land where it is signified to Madrid. So I was quite confused when it said Richard Serra, Guernica, Benghazi. This is a room at the Reina Sofia that was particularly done for this picture. There's squares and rectangles that alternate. They're all exactly the same height. They're all exactly the same thickness. They're all equal. They're all parallel. And what Richard Serra is saying is that he's transferring his thoughts here about the bombing of Benghazi by American troops and the bombing of Guernica by German troops as being equal and parallel in his mind. Imagination. So we're going to look a little bit at the imagination of Richard Serra. And I have used a portrait here by he was at Yale for graduate school. And one of his close friends was Chuck Close. And I used this portrait because while I was working on this presentation, Chuck Close passed away last month. There is Richard Serra with one of the works that he's doing today. And truth in talking, Richard Serra was my boyfriend for a period of time at my senior year of college and first year of graduate school. So there he is being kid-like and youthful in those shots on the left as a student in the middle. He was an English major, one of the top English majors at University of California at Santa Barbara. Aldous Huxley was the teacher in residence, and he took only top students, including Richard Serra, as one of his students. But Richard Serra's passion was painting, which you see him covered with on the right. And he was kind of a bad boy. Um, he got a reputation in Europe first, where he was putting live pigs in cages. He brought a bunch of logs into the Norton Simon Museum in Pasadena. And he was doing all this because he wanted to break away from two-dimensional work. He had looked at Las Meninas and thought, I want to do something where the viewer is part of the work. So he left painting. And then another thing that gave him his reputation as a bad boy was this tilted arc in New York. I mentioned this last week when we started talking about the destruction of art, because what is happening here is that Richard did this. He has taken Corten steel and molded it to go in to complement the lines of the plaza, of the Federal Plaza in New York. And this is a commissioned work by the United States of America to put in the Federal Plaza. The workers said, look, we go on these short breaks and we can't even get out of here because of that damn wall that's in the way. So the United States government took it away. Richard Serra sued the United States government, lost, but since then, site-specific art that's being created is done with lots of different contracts, so it's not moved. So I think Richard Serra is the artist that I have tracked more than any other, following his work from place to place, and we've seen each other a few times since our school days. He's not an easy to understand. This is on the left, I'm posing with what's called by the locals a banana at the Museum of Modern Art in Fort Worth. And on the right, we have the back of the Reina Sofia Museum. See that glass elevator? I was in that glass elevator and two ladies were talking and they looked down at this plaza here at this object in front of us with all the graffiti and they said, oh, that looks like a Richard Serra. Well, of course, they got a piece of my mind, but let's go on. So what has become the masterpiece of Richard Serra is a series of what are called torqued ellipses. These are mostly created by bending Corten steel in very mathematical ways in Germany, brought to wherever they are, installed in Europe, from Qatar to all over the world, and reassembled into pieces that the viewer can go inside. If later you want to read this caption, it talks about how a vision in his childhood led Richard Serra to creating these works. This one, again, in a special room that his friend Frank Gehry made for him at the Guggenheim in Balboa, is a matter of time. It's 7 different torqued ellipses sculptures, and they proceed down 403 feet. And the idea is to go inside, because when you go inside, it's like a fun house. But what it does is make you a part of the art, so that you feel the walls caving in on you at times, going out at times. And it's called a matter of time because the time it takes you to go through each of the sculptures and to go from one end to the other. Here's one scene from the top. And for a long time, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art was under construction. During that time, this piece called Sequence in the upper left-hand corner was at Stanford. It's owned by the Fisher family, the creators of The Gap, who own a lot of the art that is in San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. So it was held here temporarily. Well, in my Serra stocking, I even took a picture of the rust that was left when it was moved back from Stanford to go into that atrium that I showed you last week, is where the Diego Rivera mural is now. So this spring, I revisited it. Now it's back at Stanford. You too can walk through, only an hour and a half away, walk through a Richard Serra sculpture. And then there's this shift in King City in Ontario, Canada. You can see the landscape where the artwork is becoming part of the landscape. And it is 13 acres of these cement sections. You can see how badly destroyed they're becoming, but they're not maintaining them. They'll go into the earth eventually and become an impermanent work of art, a temporary work of art. And I'm showing that as a transition to the next work called Running Fence. Some of you may have seen it. It extends for 24.5 miles down to the ocean at Bodega Bay, where I know that some of you are acquainted with that area. And it becomes this wall, this running fence made of fabric. Again, the artwork is part of the scenery. I wonder if you know the artist. It's Running Fence, created by Cristo, who died last year. There he is with his wife. Really, Cristo, that's not his name, you can see it down below, and his wife together are Cristo. And one of the things that Cristo is known for is wrapping things as a work of art. So here he is, Cristo and Jean-Claude, posing in front of wrapping the Reichstag in Berlin. Here he has wrapped islands in Florida. So that what we're looking at as a photograph now is a photograph which itself is a work of art, looking at a work of art that is part of the landscape. Some imagination. Cristo is standing there on the left. He passed away last year on this dock that he has conceived on a lake in Italy. You can see his concept drawings for it. These are permanent. This is part of his artwork, but his other things are all temporary, as is Richard Serra's Shift. So you can see his concept for it here. And people becoming the artwork as they walk along the docks. The Valley Curtain in Colorado that he's draped across just to make that particular view altered by this addition of the curtain. It turns into a different landscape, a different work of art. Some of you have run or walked through the gates in New York City when they were up. You see the concept drawing on the left, the map he made of where they would go. You see them in snow in the middle. You see them next to the New York skyline up there, and people who are jogging under them. And Cristo conceived of actually wrapping the Arch of Triumph in Paris, but he passed away before it could be created. On the right, you see the beginning of creating the wrapped Arc de Triomphe in Paris. Today, if you go and Google wrapped Arc of Triumph, you will have a live, and look, put live screening there, it'll be easier to find, just put live stream. You can go live to Paris and see the Arc de Triomphe wrapped, although it's getting pretty dark, might be hard to see. And then here we have a warning, a personal story. He did this wrapped artwork, it wrapped modern art book. And a friend of mine was the editor of Abrams Books, and they were waiting to get the book because they were doing a book about Cristo, and they wanted to photograph this, and it hadn't come. So he called down to the mailroom and said, "Hey, have you seen this thing called the modern art book that's wrapped?" He said, "Oh yeah, we unwrapped it. We sent it up." Okay, another piece of destroyed art. Now on the right, you see what looked like a wrapped Vermeer and a wrapped Rembrandt. They're not. They are again photographic paintings by our friend Sparne, the Dutch painter whose work is so pornographic, photographic. I don't think he does pornography. And here we have them as commodities. He's painted this plastic on there and he's put little price tags on them, talking a little bit about, these can become flea market objects, about the whole idea of money and art that was the subject that was brought up last week. There is no life I know to compare with pure imagination. And here is an artist who was filled with imagination and childlike joy. You can guess who it is by what looks like his toy there, but it's one of his pieces of art. And that's our Alexander Calder, an American who spent a lot of time working in Paris. He created stables. Now you see the flamingo in Chicago on the left, La Grande Voile, which means the big sail. This is at MIT in Cambridge. And on the right, the Jerusalem stable, which is on a hillside in Jerusalem, where these arches provided different points of view to look out at the landscape. And here's La Grande Vitesse, which means the great swiftness in French, or the Grand Rapids. And it's in Grand Rapids, Michigan. At SF MoMA, you can go to the room of Calder's. I love to try blowing on them to see if I can make them move. You can also look at the back there. See, in front of that living wall outside, you can see one of his stables. His mobiles are really events, just like walking through a Richard Serra is an artistic event, because they are always moving. The color combinations are always changing. There's always motion. The forms are complementing each other's in different ways. So there's our two Untitled, and on the right we have Fishy. So playing with Calder, you have two here that are a combination of stables, the big fat banana, and mobiles, the big crinkly. But one of the reasons I'm in love with Calder is his circus. He created this circus. The first time I saw it, I was at the Whitney in New York, and they had a video. They had this under plexiglass, and they also had a video going showing Calder playing with this circus that he created. Here are some of the objects. The lion, if you pump it, blows a balloon. The ringmaster's there, the clown, the tuba player. There's a picture from his video of him making the lion roar. You can see the size of it contrasted with the peanuts from the circus. It's a wonderful book. This is a book that not only is a treat to the eyes, but to the ears in imagination, talking about the sounds that you can imagine from Calder's circus. In a great children's book called Sandy Circus, there he is opening up the magic that's inside that suitcase on the left. In the middle, he's drawing the circus, and in the back, you see the circus audience, as if, just like what I showed you with the Michelangelo creation thing, the artist is creating something that will be caught by the viewer. And on the right, we see Calder playing with his circus, surrounded by his mobiles. So this is our last artist. This Russian-born artist once said that the dignity of the artist lies in his duty of keeping awake the sense of wonder in the world. For this artist, it was also the wonder of his religion, as you can see in this self-portrait, with the tefillin, the box containing scripture that's strapped to his head, the yarmulke, the 2 stars of David that you can see there. There's his paint palette. That was another sense of wonder for him. You see there's different kinds of, like a flying cow. So his wonder is filled with a dreamlike quality. And another thing is that he was a victim, a Russian Hasidic Jew who had to leave Russia during the pogroms and came to take up residence and become a citizen of France, and had many, many hard situations wanting to go back to his village. He had the death of his long love. But through all of this and through all the different types of artistic movements that were going on, this artist stayed true to this sense of imagination and wonder. Probably some of you know who this is. Marc Chagall. There he is with his dreamlike paintings, his tongue between his teeth, kind of childlike with his paintbrushes. Many people connect him with the Fiddler on the Roof because his paintings often have the Fiddler on the Roof. The Fiddler on the Roof from the play is taken from stories by Sholem Aleichem about the type of Russian village that Chagall grew up in. So he's picturing the kinds of stories that Sholem Aleichem would have written about. Well, books about him also are showing his dreamlike quality. Children's book about wonder, about being a dreamer. Eye in the Village is one of the most important. It also is at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Here we have the Green Man, which many people think is a picture of Chagall. The village behind, so this is a picture that is showing the Russian village that he had to leave. On the left, I see this as a cow. I've heard some people call it a goat. And I'm sorry that in this picture, you can't see that there's a very, very thin line that is drawn between the eye of the cow and the eye of the Green Man. And this is a part of Chagall's heritage, his aesthetic heritage, of the close connection in the world between man and woman as in nature. At the top, you see scenes from the village, the lack of necessity for gravity, the childlike wonder you see in children's pictures. Scene from the village on the left of a death and the people mourning it. Look at the woman on the right whose hands are up like the women in Guernica mourning the death of perhaps her husband. There's the Fiddler on the Roof. By the way, the Fiddler on the Roof is an expression that was used in the stories. It also refers to the fact that of how he has to keep his balance while he's playing his fiddle. So it also has to do with the balance between fantasy and reality, of keeping our balance in the world. So at the top, you see a magical figure that's crossing the road, and you see that lack of gravity in the one below. So I've talked often about a book called Mindfulness by Christophe André, the psychiatrist who has a book about all different forms of mindfulness, 25 different paintings that there are essays on mindfulness. And he has another one called Happiness. And that one, this is one where he talks about simple happiness, where it doesn't take great elaborate things in your life. Here you have a simple peasant, just so joyful, feeding his horse. And let's look at a detail of that. On the left, look at the detail of the house. See the people around the table. Remember that lamplight that I pointed out in Carrie Mae Weems' And in Guernica, here it is again, a symbol of the family, of the warmth of the family. On the right, we see an early painting by, yes, by Van Gogh, his Potato Eaters. Here, in the dark colors of perhaps Goya, we see not a morose family, but a content family with the simple pleasures of eating potato around the lamplight that once again shines over them and illuminates them. He's also called the painter of love. He had a long love affair with his wife Bella. Here's the wedding scene. You can see on there that he is showing a wedding, bride all dressed. He loves to do the combination of animals and people showing their affinity. The couple in the bliss of their love, flying out through the window, flying over the village, carried by their love. He had fantasy too. Remember the Harlequins, the circus performers that we saw from Picasso? Here is Chagall dealing with these wonderful pastel colors. Another dreamlike scene. There's the animal. There's the cow. At first, I thought that was like a satyr with a cow back instead of a horseback, but I think it's just kind of got the cow behind the man. I may be wrong. Love that big sun back there. So Chagall and another painter who had Mark in his name both showed cows in imaginative ways. On the left, you have, yes, Franz Marc from the Blue Rider period, showing this flying yellow cow. And on the right, perhaps I was influenced by him when I showed my high wire act. We have a cow without a wire and his balancing act by Chagall. On the website, we're going to show you, you can look at a video we have of this museum in Nice in the south of France, right near the Picasso, the Matisse Museum, which is also on that video. Here is the largest collection of Chagall's religious art. So here we have the Moses receiving the tablets. We have a rabbi on the right. We have a crucifixion scene. We also have behind this crucifixion scene, scenes from the pogroms in Russia, the burnings of villages, the frightened Jews that are running away down below. The yellow Christ on the right, remember I showed you a yellow Christ from Gauguin. Chagall on the right with his palette looking up at the Christ. And if that wasn't enough, Chagall did stained glass all around the world with the help of people who are experts at it, designing them for cathedrals as well as for small little chapels like in the south of France in Vence. And all over, the one on the left is a Christian, the one on the right is Judaic. And if that's not enough, he designed the ceiling for the Paris Opera House when he was 76. And in it, you see the different characters from the different operas that are played there. And with that, we'll look at Chagall, still a child inside, painting at the end. And I have a quote from Rachel Carson, the naturalist, the scientist who was so responsible for beginning the green movement, the eco movement. And in that book, she said, if I had influence with the good fairy, I would ask that her gift to each child be a sense of wonder so indestructible that it would last throughout life. And that's my wish for you.